So again, welcome. This is our panel on powering data centers. So our goal in choosing this topic is so that we could use as many buzzwords as possible. You'll hear some probably direct-to-chip cooling, some microgrids. Maybe we'll throw in some small modular nuke even. We'll see where this goes. A lot of acronyms. We're going to try to avoid acronyms, although to say artificial intelligence all the time probably doesn't make sense, so maybe we'll give a pass on that one. So I'm John Rhodes. I'm a founder of our built environment technology team at Accenture, so I've been working in the space of automation and controls and power for a good part of 20 years. Collaborate with people like Prologis on managing their property and Johnson Controls in deploying technology. And everyone is thinking about data centers now and what data centers are going to do to break the grid. It wasn't EV charging, it hasn't been electrification, but it probably will be data centers. So I want to start off with my esteemed panelists here to do a bit of an introduction. And if you could also maybe tell a short anecdote about when you first started working with data centers and what you saw, maybe even in comparison to what you're seeing now. So Parag.
Parag Soni, Prologis, Global Head of Utility Strategy Engagement. Nobody told me before this that we'd be following a powerhouse panel beforehand. So, but honored here, and I think you guys are in the home stretch of Climate Week, so thank you very much for joining us. My first exposure, most of my career has been spent working with utilities and kind of behind the scenes with utilities on getting large loads on, procuring power generation, kind of helping utilities meet all the different needs, reliability, resilience, all of those things. And the first exposure to data centers was working on behalf of one of the utilities down in San Antonio. And, it was early in the data center, development. And this data center came to San Antonio and said, we'd like to, get a data center built in your area. We'd like you to provide power to it. We'd like you to provide transmission capacity. And those were all fine. But they said, we want a dedicated transmission line. We want dedicated renewables for our data center. And so, these were early challenges for utilities in trying to figure out, they were accustomed to putting large loads on, but a data center had some unique requirements in terms of its on uptime and all of these things. And I think utilities struggled in the early days on how to meet all the specific requirements. And the early data centers wanted all of their power to come from renewable resources. So I think these were some of the early challenges that data center faced and some of the early challenges and exposure that I had in my career.
Great.
I'm Matt Keitlinger. I head up the data center sales team for Johnson Controls. I'll give you the JCI commercial here. We do, controls, we do fire, and we do security, certainly. There's a couple of different brands on the thermal management side. There's York chillers, air-cooled chillers, water-cooled chillers, where we're very, very relevant, especially with the liquid-to-chip, direct-to-chip that you see. And then, obviously, Silent-Aire, a lot on the air side, both direct-to-vap cooling for a lot of the hyperscale. They do a lot of modular builds, modular data centers, some really sophisticated, unique things inside the white space. So they do some pretty cool stuff. So we have both the York and then the Silent-Aire side. I've been in this business since 1999. It's changed a lot. Maybe I'll tell this little story. I first started off, I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and I started with a company called Liebert or Vertiv now. And I started in the outside sales, and I remember getting my first purchase order. It was for a Mini-Mate. A Mini-Mate hangs in the ceiling. It was like 5 tons, okay? This was a whole server room back then. That's kind of how has it changed? Certainly the size and the density we're seeing. So think about 5 tons. That's under 20 kW. Think about the racks that we're cooling today with direct-to-chip and those water loops, 200 kW. So, you get your first purchase order, you actually frame it. It was really exciting. And we just had moved like a year ago. I moved back to my childhood house, by the way. And so moving back there, I'm unboxing all of these boxes, and I find the framed purchase order. which, by the way, I'm not allowed to put up. So maybe in the garage or something like that. So that's really the size, scale, and density, and a lot of times the complexity and how fast these data centers are moving. The size and complexity that we're dealing with today is unbelievable.
Great, thanks, Matt. All right, so in our questions, I want to run through what's happening now and then what it's going to look like in a couple of years, and then further on into the future when we're going to solve all of these problems, right? So now in the news recently, there was a story by the grid operator in the Northeast. I'm going to have to use an acronym of PJM, where they proposed cutting off power to new data center loads first in line when they have a power emergency. So a lot of the data center operators obviously don't like this, and they're pushing back very hard. But do we see this as a sign that's going to push a lot of data centers off grid and have to set up their own power generation systems? And is that coming? Are you talking to clients who are considering that?
Mark, I'll give it to you first.
All right, perfect.
Closer.
Perfect. So this is a very interesting question, and it's an evolving situation. So ERCOT, sorry to use an acronym, Texas, was the first ISO this year to implement what is called a kill switch, right? Where large loads, anything over 75 megawatts, has the opportunity to be curtailed when Texas has a energy event. And so, a lot of people were surprised and a lot of people concerned, is this a growing trend, right? PJM is now the second ISO to implement it. And, the question is, why is all of this being done? And what's the context for why this is necessary? And I think if you look across and look at the studies, use another acronym, the National Electric Renewable Corporation, puts out studies every year, and it talks about the reliability. And in the next couple of years, they are projecting 9 out of the 13 different energy markets in the US are going to face some type of shortage in terms of power, right? They're going to fall below a critical threshold for ensuring reliability in their specific markets. So grid operators are very, very concerned about this. We're seeing prices increase exponentially across markets. PJM is just one of many. If you look at what the rate increases last year were, so in the magnitude of about 59 billion in rate increases, right? And these rates are increasing 10, 20% across the board. And grid operators are very concerned about the implications, right? The news story that they don't want to read is that we had to turn off all of this residential power, or we had to have blackouts because we needed to support a data center. So I think all of these concerns are starting to bubble up, and grid operators are responding to that situation. So I would not be surprised to see other grid operators following suit and taking large loads, offering a kill switch, offering curtailments, which is not going to make, obviously data centers and other large loads. But what it means is that we're going to have to build resiliency. And for data centers, they're going to have to build backup generation, right? And if you talk to hyperscalers, when they're building data centers, they have a strong preference for putting their data centers on the grid. Because if they are solely reliant on backup generation, then it becomes very difficult for them to have, additional generation capacity. And so if they at least are on the grid, but they have backup generation, then they're at least have some type of coverage in the event of a grid outage. But the question is, how much? Is it the full amount of your data center? Is it a portion of your data center? So these are some of the questions that data center developers are trying to address. But it is a trend that I think is going to grow in the coming years as grid operators start to fall below the reliability thresholds.
Great, Matt?
Yeah, there's no doubt there's a lot of bad press about the rate increases on residential and what that impact is. I think it came out in Columbus, Ohio, for example, which is a hotbed of data centers, what American Electric Power is doing. The other part of that is for the utilities to flip back and make these data centers pay more. And I think that was the whole point of, on the transmission side, on the demand side, of what American Electric Power did, is they really came out and said, okay, we're going to base that on your peak demand. A data center load, once it gets up and running, is very, very stable. the thing that, it's obviously summer peaking. The thing that then puts them at peak is summer loads. Most utilities are summer load peaking. So to then base that rate on the peak power of any given month at any given point in time, a block of time throughout the year, is really what they pay for throughout the years of those contracts, right? So that's number one. I think there's going to be a lot more coordination that happens. All these big data centers have backup generation, just megawatts and megawatts in their utility or their gen sets that they can bring online in case there's a utility failure. I think there's going to be a lot of coordination around that peak power of when to bring that backup generation on to shave that peak off. So it's all about flatlining that peak, especially on those hot summer days where, you get into those excursion days where you're 110 and 115 and you hear about the heat island effects of the heat rejection. That's really where everything peaks. It's not the winter peak, and utilities aren't utility peaking anyhow. So in coordination with the on-site generation, the backup generation, you can shave that peak off. And I think there's going to be a lot more, coordination, even SCADA, utility-style SCADA systems that are integrated to coordinate when to take that offline. And even if it was for 4 hours during the heat of the day on certain days, I think you're going to see more of that to kind of manage the energy flow.
Yeah. I'd just like to add one more thing to what he was saying. So, you heard Melanie talk about this in the earlier panel, that they're working on AI technology to unleash some of the transmission capacity that is not being used. When a utility develops its system, it is built for the peak hours of any particular day. And so at any specific given time, any particular year, and if you look at how much idle capacity there is on the utility system, it's almost 50%. It's a huge number. And so one of the things we're going to try to figure out in the coming years with the benefit of AI and all of these different companies that are out there, how to unleash that unused capacity, that idle capacity that utilities have built into the system that is not always being used. And so I think, we have some innovative solutions that could be coming down the road that could solve for some of these problems.
Okay, great. So I wanted to sneak this in before we go to some of the longer term solutions, but my team right now is trying to reconcile the sales figures for chips with how much additional power capacity that's going to drive. So just looking at one company, NVIDIA, and their Blackwell chips and their GB200 acronyms, I probably don't even know what that means, but their newest chipsets are estimated to drive almost 40 gigawatts if they're fully installed over the next 18 months. So by comparison, that is about what the US added in additional capacity over the last year. So just one company, not including cooling, maybe is going to double the required capacity. So if that happens and we require doubling the new capacity in the very near term, can the equipment providers even keep up if they want to do on-site? Are we going to be able to produce enough power on-site, even separate from the grid, to be able to serve the growth plans of these companies?
Yeah, I think you'd add 30% of that through the electrical inefficiencies and the cooling system on your peak day. Yep. So that becomes a really big number. The gating factor is power right now. Can't get enough power. And I think it's an all the above strategy. I think there's small modular reactors, SMRs, there's an acronym for you. I think it's on-site power generation. It's taken over crypto facilities out there. Crypto uses a lot of power out there, and it's, these are big 200 and 400 megawatt sites where it becomes more financially feasible than or beneficial maybe to put an AI data center with that power that's available than it does to mine crypto. So we see a lot of these changes. The other part of that is with AI and the training. Training can be anywhere, right? Big, large language training modules. Latency isn't an issue. And so the training happens in these gigawatt facilities. They're unimaginable how big these are. These are campuses. If anybody's ever seen a 100 megawatt data center, imagine 10 of those on a campus. It's just fascinating. A lot of chillers, by the way. And so when you think about the power, that on-site power generation, we see a lot of gas turbines, that are all of a sudden going in the middle of nowhere. Who would have thought Abilene, Texas, and this is things that have been announced, for example, a 3 gigawatt campus that will ultimately be the largest data center in the world in the middle of nowhere in Texas, right? That's different than latency.
It
Latency.
gets hot in Abilene too.
It gets hot in Abilene, right? Very high ambience, and so that's different than latency. Latency, than inference. That really is about latency, and so that will happen closer to users, closer to populations. That is coming. Once these machines get trained and get put to work, the edge will start to look like these big data centers in terms of density right now. And so one of the things, for example, at Johnson Controls in York, we're constantly looking at that peak power with different technology. Katie talked about this as a mag bearing technology, where all of a sudden what they really care about when they're building a data center, they don't want to buy our chillers, for example, and have us use energy. But because of that direct to chip and the liquid cooling, that's really a requirement. And so to lower that peak power, if you're in a 100 megawatt data center, and now all of a sudden with a mag bearing chiller, you can give back 5 more megawatts to the IT. Think about $10 to $12 million per megawatt. That's what it costs to build these, right? Not to mention the reoccurring revenue over the life of 20 years. That's real dollars. And so we're constantly looking at and stepping back and looking at the entire electrical infrastructure and those blocks of power, including the genset, the switchgear, and how we can provide more power to the chips, not consume less, or not consume more power. And so there's PUE, that's annualized throughout the year. That's saving kilowatts and the meter spinning. But there's that peak power. That's really what that utility is based on. And if we use more of that peak power, that's less for IT.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to sneak in one more question, and then we'll go to the audience for some questions as well. So, what does the longer-term solution look like? So, if we're going to see even 20 or 30% going off-grid, going on natural gas, is there an evolution to something more sustainable in the longer term? And if so, what might that be?
So earlier this month, Foreign Affairs published an article called The Coming Electricity Crisis, and it basically concluded that we do not have enough generation to keep up with the demand, right? The demand is growing exponentially. It's the equivalent, I think, DOE and NERC and some other organizations said, about an 18% growth, which is the equivalent of California, New York, and Texas combined would be coming on in the next kind of decade. Obviously, that's an enormous number of demand coming on. And so we're entering a period where we need access to all the generation resources, right? And if we go kind of one by one, look at gas generation. Gas generation, gas turbines have a 50-month backlog, right? I mean, it's just, do we have enough pipeline capacity? Or is all of that pipeline capacity being shipped out of the country? We have coal. Coal is kind of out of the money, right? That's not a resource we can count on. Nuclear is going to take 10 years to build, right? So we're taking, solar, wind off the table, right? So just at a time when we need more generation resources, we seem to be bottlenecked in some resources and taking other resources off the table. So where does that leave us? Geothermal is coming up, on the back end. I know Fervo has signed a number of contracts, including with Microsoft. So there are technologies that are coming. I think I would go back to Bill Gates's thing that much of the technology we need to resolve climate change and even maybe our generation hasn't been invented yet. And so, I don't think we have the generation. So what are the other things we can rely on? And this is one area that the Prologis is very heavily involved in, which is distributed generation, right? And there is a belief that we are going to need consumers to step in much more to help with distributed generation, right? Companies like Prologis that's building a gigawatt of solar on its rooftops, building storage, building microgrids, building linear generators, not only for our own warehouses to reduce our load, but also to give back to the grid. And if, to make a shameless plug, in about a week, we're going to have our own major energy event called Groundbreakers. And at that event, I predict that you'll hear some of the utility CEOs tell you that consumers have to be part of the solution, right? Both residential, C&I customers, building, different types of generation. New York, a couple years ago, piloted this concept, and they said, okay, whenever there's a large load happening in your system, what is the typical utility response? The typical response is the utility goes out and builds the substations, gets the necessary generation, and that's how they address their load. But let's say, can we flip that on its head? Instead of increasing, paying for a substation, paying your rate of return, can we figure out a way for the customers to reduce their own load? And so this was called the New York REV program. It had mixed success, but it was trying to basically empower customers to build their own distributed resources, to bring down their load so that the utility wouldn't have to build all the infrastructure. As we move forward, I believe that distributed generation is going to play a much bigger role. We need technology and innovation to enable that. We need bidirectional power lines. We need all of the technology. We need them to be able to aggregate different resources. So in California, Sunrun has aggregated residential batteries and has provided 80 megawatts to the grid. So imagine, a C&I customer like Prologis, how many hundreds of megawatts we could provide to the grid at peak times. So these are the types of solutions that I think are needed to solve the future problem.
Okay, great. So you're going to have to answer the first question now. So I know there are a lot of experts in the house. Yeah, we're gonna take a question. So if anyone wants to stump the panel, do we have any takers? All right, that corner. I'll make a run for it. Or you can speak very loudly if you'd like.
So, at least in New York State, we have, so I'm an old guy, as you can see, right? Cogeneration to me was something that was good. It got killed in New York State, and you're saying, and I think you're right, that we need a lot more power. So what are we, is there any talk about rejuvenating cogeneration in New York State?
I just heard good luck. I don't know about New York State. We do need more power. I think it, like I said before, it's all the above, depending on the area you are in the country. It could be wind, it could be solar, it could be natural gas. Natural gas is both turbine firing it or actually through fuel cells. So I think it's all the above. The point is we're going to need more generation, and where that's going to come from, whether it's partnerships with utilities that the big hyperscale and colos are working on right now to fund some of these projects, nuclear as well. I personally think nuclear is probably a lot of what the future is going to see. It may take a while to get there, but that's base load and very reliable energy as well. But yeah, there's that side on the generation side. I think there's a lot of effort as well on the efficiency side that's really coming into play, and how to get those efficiencies, particularly on the cooling side and electrical losses, to provide more IT capacity. But there's no way around it. You're going to need more generation. That's just a fact. But I do think there's a lot of effort that can go on to shave those peaks off between the big consumers with these gigawatt facilities, and what that looks like to shave those peaks off, so that we don't need that that entire capacity on the worst design day in the last 20 years type of thing.
Okay, great.
They say never, and in New York, they spent years trying to kill nuclear, right? Indian Point, and yet I think the governor announced that a new nuclear plant is now being considered built by NYPA. So technologies have a way of coming back when the need arises, and I think
Has arisen.
a phoenix has arisen from the ashes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to thank our host, Microsoft, and our panelists. So please join me in thanking our panelists.